Welcome to this session on writers and the pandemic. And I mean, as you can see, again, with this mask, that the pandemic has changed our lives, all of our lives, in one way or the other. And I'm sure it has also changed the way writers have dealt with their work. And we will be discussing certain aspects of that. But before we go into that discussion, let me first introduce the speakers and also say a few words about Birutjatio, the small press that we run from here in Santiniketan, and a little bit about the kind of work we do. On my right is Professor Ananya Dutta Gupta, who is of course also my teacher and has been teaching here at Visva-Bharati for over 19 years. She has an MPhil and a PhD in Renaissance English Literature from the University of Oxford and Jadavpur University, respectively. Her most recent publications are a bilingual book of anecdotes about her son's growing years titled Abhi Buli, which is in Bangla, and the diary of a Quipster Boy, and a debut collection of poems on birds with accompanying illustrations for Tomorrow the Birds Might Still Sing, which was brought out by Birutjatio. The next panelist is Anindita Ghosh, who has made a great effort to join in from Jaipur, I believe. Thank you.
I really wish I was there in
Anindita
person.
Ghosh is an author and journalist based in Mumbai. Her debut novel, The Illuminated, has been featured on the 2021 Best Fictions list by the Telegraph and the Times of India, amongst others. The Independent has picked Anindita as one of their 9 best upcoming authors from India. Anindita has a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Mumbai and a master's in arts and culture journalism from Columbia University. And she has previously been the editor of the Saturday magazine, Mint Lounge. Thank you once again for joining us. On the far right of the stage, we have Shambhobi Ghosh, who is now a business writer at PwC India Acceleration Center in Kolkata, having trained in English literature and ecology and environmental studies. Her stories, poems, and literary translations have appeared in magazines and anthologies in India and the UK. In 2016, she was awarded the Shera Bangali Kalker Shera Ajke Award for Literature by the ABP Media Group. On my left, we have Tarit Roychoudhury. Tarit is also my teacher from my Pathabhavan days. Tarit Roychoudhury completed his higher education from Jadavpur University and teaches Bangla at Pathabhavan, Visva-Bharati. An avid reader and thespian, he is a frequent contributor to several reputed journals across Bengal. He is also the co-convener of Intact Santiniketan, which has facilitated his engagement with the conversation and awareness of our cultural heritage. Presently, he is the editor of the journal Nikhil Bharat Bongo Sahitya Sammiloni, Santiniketan branch. His latest collection of poems, which we published from Birutjatio, is a Bengali collection called Corona Kaler Kobita. I will just sort of take a couple of moments to talk about Birutjatio. I mean, Shambhobi has been associated with Birutjatio before it was called Birutjatio, when we started writing together so many years ago. I mean, Birutjatio came into being as a small, what is called a little magazine. I mean, that's where we started out in 2008. And we used to take printouts from our computers and bind it, and initially only distributed it, not even sold it. So that's the starting point from which we eventually have metamorphosed into a small press. And it is really an honor to be able to speak about our work in front of so many great publishers in this room. So, I mean, thank you for that opportunity. I will just sort of not go into the history of what we do, but also the kind of work we do is that we publish mostly bilingually, as in we do both Bangla and English books. And of course, publishing from Santiniketan, which does not really have the best technology in terms of printing presses, means that we get our books printed in Kolkata, but we do all the other work from Santiniketan, and what we have been able to do, and because I've been thinking, like when I was asked to talk about Birutjatio, I didn't know what to say. So I would say that what we have been able to do, what I think is our biggest achievement, is that we have been able to bring together a lot of diverse books, in the sense that we publish, of course, as you can see, people from Santiniketan, but we also publish others. I mean, we have our bilingual American poetry series, which is an ongoing project, which has published the works of people like Jean Valentine, June Jordan, Anne-Marie Macari, and others. So we are doing what we learned at Santiniketan to bring different people of the world together. That's what I would think. The other thing that I just sort of wanted to start off on is that for an organization of our size, it has been very difficult to survive the pandemic, because between March and July 2020, we sold no books, zero. And I seriously considered closing down, because I didn't think that I'll be able to sustain it, or we will be able to sustain it through the pandemic. But again, I think it's also easier for something of a smaller scale to survive. And so we have been able to do that. Let us move on to our discussion on writers and the pandemic. And I would like to bring in Anindita first to start the conversation. How has the pandemic influenced the way you write? Both in terms of, I mean, maybe it has given you more time, or maybe less even with some of us, or what you have written during the pandemic. Has it in any way changed the way you write?
Firstly, hello to everyone, and thank you for having me. You know, I think writers have such an interior process, honestly, that I don't know as much if a pandemic is altering the way I've written. I had a first book out, my first novel was out in 2021, July, but I'd been working on it already for 6 years. So the pandemic for me was more a time for editing and, final touches. It was actually almost cruel for me, because I finished my first draft just when the COVID pandemic happened. So until then, I had been desperately stealing time, trying to get away from social engagements, trying to keep up the bare minimum of social life to be a functioning daughter and wife and human being. And I finished my draft and the pandemic started. But now I am a writer in the pandemic, and I quite value the isolation and the interiority and the work from home. I think it can only be good for a writer. That said, I think there are different phases when one is actively working on a work. There is a phase where you need nutrition from the world outside, where you do need conversations, you need to go out and watch movies, take walks in nature. That is a part of writing as well. And then there's the part where you're just editing and structuring. So I think for the second part, the pandemic was good, but I did miss conversations and the creative nutrition that I think every writer needs. So I'm glad that we are now at a place where we can have a little bit of that as well.
Ananya, the poems that constitute your book, and some of them, particularly the later ones, were written during the pandemic. How do you see your work evolving as you probably had more time at home? Or also, I mean, as it led to many of us probably pausing from our lives and having a chance to think about it in a way. I mean, hasn't the pandemic and the lockdown also brought that about?
Let me begin with a preamble. I'm very fortunate to be here. I don't know what qualifies me, except that you've been kind enough to publish some of my, serendipitously, some of the poems that I happened to write over the past 2 years, and my gratitude to Nabanna. And may I also begin with an aside to the previous panelist. I really enjoyed reading The Illuminated. It's touched me in so many different ways. Thanks so much. Well, I kind of agree with Anindita. I can't quite say that do not see writing necessarily as something that the pandemic has made happen. Writing has its own logic, it follows its own trajectories, which can be affective, which can be psychic, which can be intellectual. And I kind of am quite entirely and serendipitously, epiphanically self-found a voice in, I'm sure, poetry that nobody else would be interested in reading about. It's mostly my dialogue with myself. But of course, you don't talk to yourself, you try to kind of fashion something else out there to talk to. And interestingly, kind of birds fell into that role. And again, I don't know how that happened. I found them, they found me, something along those lines. And I guess writing happens at the cusp of these interesting, the intersection of strange factors, and pandemic meant more time at home and a gaze that was relatively uninterrupted. I have always been something of a window watcher, but now I simply had a little more leisure to look out from the window. Pandemic meant that work at the adjoining mill had come to a halt, which meant that the place was reclaimed by nature. So more birds were coming into the space that was accessible to me sensorily, kind of in an ocular and oral way through my window, because I'm not a very adventurous person. I don't naturally just go out, and I lack the courage to do that. Well, that apart, I think what the pandemic allowed me kind of has, looking back, I think it's been a trajectory of interesting phases of engaging with my interior processes, mostly feeling, thought, emotion, interactions with the world, with persons. And I've kind of used my conversations in poems as a way of marking this journey. So coming out of the pandemic has involved a certain kind of a shift, which I'm looking at. And my problem is or maybe it's not a problem. The duality comes from the fact that I teach literature. So I am pathologically self-conscious. I wish I weren't. I think I'd be writing more interestingly if I weren't so conscious about myself. But it also allows me to be constantly kind of looking at myself. That kind of works with the title for this session, Inside Outside. I'm constantly looking at myself from the outside and the inside by turn. So looking back, I see something unfolding, but while it was in process, I don't think I knew what was happening.
তরিতদা, আমরা যারা আজকে আড্ডা দিচ্ছি তাদের মধ্যে সবথেকে স্পেসিফিক্যালি করোনা কালের কথা লেখার মধ্যে আপনি বলেছেন, সেইটা কিভাবে আসছে?
হ্যাঁ, মানে আসলে যেটা ওনাদের দুজন বললেন সেটা আমার ক্ষেত্রেও সত্যি, যে একটা অবসর সময়টা বেড়ে গেল আমাদের এই সময়টাতে, সেটা অবশ্যই সত্যি। তো সেইটা ওনারা বলেছেন, আমি সেটাই যাচ্ছি না। আমার কাছে অন্য দুটো জিনিস ছিল। একটা হচ্ছে যে আমি নর্মালি আসলে পাঠভবনে পড়াই, এখানে থাকি, কিন্তু আমি লকডাউনের ফার্স্ট ফেজে আটকা পড়ে গেছিলাম কলকাতায়, কারণ হঠাৎ ডিসিশন হয়েছে। ফলে আমি প্রায় একটা কারাগারে বন্দির মতোই অবস্থা তখন। মানে আমার হাতে সেখানে সাফিসিয়েন্ট কাজ নেই, অন্য কিছু অপশন নেই। তো আমার তখন যেটা মনে হয়েছিল যে এটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমার কাছে একটা চ্যালেঞ্জ। মানে আমি এর আগে তো শুনেছি যে অনেকেই, তাদের সঙ্গে আমার তুলনা হয় না, কিন্তু জেলে গেছেন, কারাগারে বন্দী হয়েছেন, তখন তারা অনেক পড়াশোনা করেছেন, অনেক লেখালেখি করেছেন, এরকম একটা প্রবণতা থাকে। তো সেইটা আমার মনে হয়েছিল, আমার কাছে দুটো দিক থেকে নিজের কাছে নিজেকে চিয়ার আপ করার জন্যই বলি, সার্ভাইভাল স্ট্র্যাটেজি বলি, যে দুটো জিনিস। এক হচ্ছে, এই ঘটনাটা আমার জীবনে আগে কখনো ঘটেনি। এই যে গোটা পৃথিবী স্তব্ধ হয়ে যাচ্ছে, প্রতিদিন মৃত্যুর খবর আসছে, মানুষের প্রতি মানুষের, মানে পাশের যে মানুষটার সঙ্গে আগে হেসে কথা বলতাম, এখন এমন ভাবে চোরা তাকাচ্ছি যেন এই তোমার করোনা হয়নি তো, তোমার থেকে আমার হবে না তো। মানে এই যে একদম পুরো প্রতিদিনের সম্পর্কের মধ্যে একটা কাঁটা এসে পড়ছে, এই যে টাইম পিরিয়ডটা, এই টাইম পিরিয়ডটাকে কোথাও ধরে রাখা দরকার। ফলে স্বাভাবিকভাবেই সেইটা আমার কাছে একটা খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ছিল, যে কারণে এই করোনাকালের কবিতার যে কবিতাগুলো, সেগুলো আমার প্রায় ডেইলি রুটিন হয়ে গিয়েছিল। যে আমি সকালবেলায় উঠে আমার কাজ ছিল আমার তার আগের দিনের রাত থেকে যে অভিজ্ঞতাগুলো জমতে থেকেছে সেটাকে কোনোভাবে একটা প্রকাশ করা। এবং শুধু কবিতা না, আমি গল্প লিখেছি, ব্লগ লিখেছি, মানে যা পেরেছি উদ্দাম লিখে গেছি। কারণ আমার মনে হয়েছিল এটা ওই ছোটবেলায় যেরকম দেখতাম একটা পাথরের ওপরে অ্যাসিড ঢালা হচ্ছে আর ছবিগুলো আস্তে আস্তে তৈরি হয়ে উঠছে, আমার কাছে এই সময়টা ছিল প্রায় তাই। ফলে আমার নিজের মনে হয়েছে যে ওই সময়টাকে ধরে রাখার জন্য অনেক বেশি বেশি করে লেখার মাধ্যমে আমি সেটা করতে পারি। আর তার বাইরে কতগুলো সামাজিক দায়বদ্ধতা ছিলই, মানে বি ফ্র্যাঙ্কলি অস্বীকার করে লাভ নেই যে আমরা যারা স্কুল টিচার তারা নিয়মিত মাইনে পেয়েছি, কিন্তু সেই অর্থে একদম প্রথম দিকে তো স্কুলের চাপটা সত্যি ছিল না। তারপরে অনলাইন ক্লাস আমার স্কুল অপেক্ষাকৃত প্রিভিলেজড বয় গার্লদের জন্য বলে হয়তো তাদের ফোন ছিল বলে অনলাইন ক্লাস চালু হয়েছে, কিন্তু তা সত্ত্বেও একটা গিয়ে যতটা সময় লাগে যতটা ইন্টারাকশন হয় সেটা হয়নি। তো আমি যখন এখানে থাকি তখন ওই বাচ্চাদের সাহিত্য সভার কথা জানো, ফলে সেই লেখালেখির মধ্যে একটা থাকতো। এখন আমার কাছে যেটা মনে হয়েছিল যে এই যে লম্বা সময়টা আমি শুধু ওদের সঙ্গে অনলাইনে ক্লাস নিচ্ছি, বাকি ইন্টারাকশন গুলো হচ্ছে না, তো আমার তো একটা দায়িত্ব আছে, আমাকে তো এই একদিন এটা শেষ হবে, আমি ওদের সঙ্গে আবার মুখোমুখি বসবো। তখন আমি যখন ওকে প্রশ্ন করছি যে তুমি এই সময়টাকে ফালতু যেতে দিও না, কিছু একটা করো, তো ও তো আমাকে প্রশ্ন করবে আমি কি করলাম। ফলে সেদিক থেকেও আমি সেই জন্যই প্রথমবার ছোটদের জন্য কিছু লেখালেখির চেষ্টা করেছি, সত্যি কথা বলতে। ফলে এই জায়গাগুলো কোথাও এক, এবং এই যে সমাজের চেহারা পাল্টে যাওয়া সেটাকে যথাসাধ্য ধরে রাখা, এবং কোথাও এই যে দায়বদ্ধতাগুলো আমার সঙ্গে আমার চারপাশে সেটাকে কোথাও লিপিবদ্ধ করার চেষ্টা, মূলত এই জায়গাগুলো থেকে আমার লেখালেখির জায়গাটা তৈরি হয়ে ওঠে।
Shambhobi, you have translated during the pandemic, and please sort of talk about a bit about your work and what it's been like translating that.
So my time during the pandemic was really strange for a number of reasons. And, it really made me think how the universe kind of, imposes some really bizarre connections that you do not foresee at the time you are starting a project. But, the more you delve into it, you realize that it really resonates with something that is going on in your personal life, things that are going on outside. So just before the pandemic hit, I started sort of living a kind of a dual life. I joined a very well-known corporate firm in Kolkata, and something that nobody thought I would do. I think I subverted everybody's expectations, including my own. I did not see myself as a corporate professional, and neither did anybody else in Santiniketan or Kolkata or literally anywhere people know me. So while I was still kind of getting accustomed to that life, kind of going to the workplace, because the workplace had not shut down at that point. And I was also wrapping up my work on Jean Lauren's collection of short stories. And Jean Lauren, I had, passingly heard of him before translating. I had not really read through his work. And yes, of course, I knew that he was part of the French decadent movement. And, his work has some really interesting similarities with Oscar Wilde, and he is influenced by Thomas De Quincey. But then the collection that I worked on, the collection that I translated into Bangla with the Spout Books, they commissioned my help on this. The collection is called The Nightmares of an Ether Drinker. So it was essentially a collection of surrealist fairy tales, very adult themes, very dark adult themes. And in a way, it was kind of a diseased man's almost confession of what ether addiction does to your brain in a sense. And through that exploration of his kind of these strange, dark fantasies, they also kind of comment on the contemporary society, the kind of problems, the kind of underlying darkness of French aristocracy, and also the deep discomfort of the author with his own sexuality, or with his own homosexuality. So in many ways, that book was about disease, about personal as well as, kind of social disease. And while I was doing the work, like I finished the lion's share of the work before the pandemic started. I was at the fag end of the translation. I was juggling this other very professional, very impersonal, corporate world. And then suddenly out of nowhere, the pandemic hits. And then one day I just find myself, sitting in my flat trying to negotiate, various technological barriers. I felt really overwhelmed by it, because at that time, I kind of started to sort of uneasily relate to the author's experience, in the way that at that time, I was also recuperating from a personal kind of life-altering medical diagnosis, which was nothing to do with COVID. It was also, very much to do with my own mental health. And it was life-altering because I had faced a major disruption before joining my new workplace. And I had not told anybody in my workplace about that. So that was also me leading another kind of double life. And then the pandemic hits. So now we had different layers of being diseased. There was the disease outside, there was this diseased man's work that I was dealing with, and then there was my own disease. So all of that, just before I kind of reached the finish line, I started to feel really overwhelmed, and I had to actually, take a step back and just to rethink what I was doing, because I felt I was getting so personally involved. It was like it was kind of a rabbit hole that I was going into. So, so even though I was very fortunate not having to directly deal with the impact of the coronavirus, I definitely felt, the effect of the larger implications of the pandemic, as it were, both in my personal and definitely my literary life.
I think I'll go over to Anindita again and ask you a specific question from your book, because we have been conversing just before this session about women's solidarity movements and how women have tried to do things differently. So would you talk about the kind of eco-feminist utopia, as it has been described, that is at the end of your book, Meenakshi's eco-feminist utopia, and the other women that you represent and how that works? Would you want to talk about that?
I think the book, just to give a brief summary, The Illuminated is set in a very typically patriarchal world. There's a rising right-wing group called MSS. No hints about what that is leading to. It's called MSS, which is a Mahalakshmi Seva Sangh, and they seek to protect women and control women. And I think architecture and space is, and in the ways in which space can be restrictive, is something I've been very interested in. Right from, I'd read stories about how before the kitchen became a separate room, the cooking area was always part of a living area. So household work and women were part of the living space. the time when the kitchen became a separate room, it kind of relegated women to this small, windowless, hot room, which was very uncomfortable for them to be in. So I've always been very interested in architecture and feminist architecture. So in the scheme of the Illuminated, when these women, Shashi and Tara more centrally, but also the cast of women around them who come from various social stratas, including their cook, who is an Adivasi girl from Sundarbans, these women are trying to break out of these patriarchal structures and systems. And I wanted the geographic move and the kind of spatial move to also be something to account for. So Shashi, the mother in the book, lives in a very fancy Delhi gated community, which is very male in that sense. It's a male idea of housing. Her husband, who's an architect, hasn't, for instance, taken into account the dust that will come in from the open wooden slats, because of course it's the women of the house who manage and keep the house clean. So a male architect isn't interested in the practical functionality of that house. So when Shashi decides to come into her own and to find her own identity, her move from that very restrictive house, the bungalow in Delhi, to a new state called Meenakshi, which is forming, which is founded by a fisherwoman who has creating a kind of revolution, I feel that spatial move was very interesting to me. And you mentioned eco-feminism, and I think that comes up a couple of times in the book. The daughter Tara also befriends an eco-feminist when she's studying Prakrit in Dharamshala. Noor's Twitter bio is lesbian, Muslim, eco-feminist. Noor doesn't smoke because cigarette butts are one of the greatest plastic pollutants, not just because of what cigarettes would do to her lungs, but because smoking cigarettes is bad for the environment. So, and I think this is a point that Noor makes, that environmental degradation has a greater impact on women in general. Women are, women's fertility or women's lives are affected in a disproportionately greater way by environmental degradation. So, that's something that I could say about ecofeminism in the book. But the spatial move to a space where it's also anti-capitalist in the sense that no one owns property in Meenakshi. You own the house, but not the land, which is something I've seen happen in certain communes, like in Oroville, for instance. You own the house, but not the land. So in the Illuminated, I've also kind of equated capitalist structures to patriarchal structures. So the idea of ownership being a male idea. So in Meenakshi, women live communally. There are communal kitchens. The architecture is round. If there is a mango tree growing through the plot of land that you've acquired, you have to build around that tree and you can't cut it down. So I think somehow just subliminally, this idea of ecofeminism was playing into the book as a kind of anti-patriarchal and anti-capitalist idea.
Ananya, if I could bring you in and ask you something about the way you perceive your work, particularly when you're writing poems about birds. Do you see yourself as a woman looking at birds, or is your gender identity not important?
Well, not that I've been writing about birds alone. So it just so happens that my poems about birds constitute quite a substantial number among within that corpus, and it thematically kind of came together in this book. I'm very wary about kind of taking on any kind of consciously gendered role as in any capacity as, well, I would do that, certainly. I'm aware of my location, gendered, social, and particularly the privileged position that I am in as a woman academic. Not all women in our society happen to be in that privileged position. And I completely second Tarit Babu's point about the fact that there's been no kind of break in our salaries being credited on the last day of every month without fail. Well, very few people could actually say that of their own professional life, men or women. I would perhaps see the feminine as a kind of category here vis-a-vis the idea of confinement. I was seeing as a woman insofar as probably Anindita also brought up in her discussion of, and in the way she represents that absence and the relegation of women to certain parts of the house or houses, an architectural space. So the confinement itself can be seen perhaps as a feminine disempowerment, as a way of spatializing feminine disempowerment. And the pandemic kind of probably redefined all human beings so confined as the feminine. The pandemic, ironically, the term pandemic would suggest something that's ubiquitous everywhere. So universally, everyone seemed to be confined. So we were all honorary females in that respect. So, and looking through the window as a motif for the woman confined, I guess, has a long history culturally, literarily, and so on. So I may have been implicitly participating in that. Well, there are ways in which probably my gaze is implicitly feminine, but I don't necessarily, I wouldn't want to be emphasizing that as I write. I think all writing at some level, all human beings are necessarily at some level androgynous, and writing should project that. I shouldn't be talking in shoulds, but we do take on roles, and there is no necessarily rationale to how we do that on the inside, in our interior lives. So I would see my writing as perhaps sometimes feminine and sometimes not. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Tarit, এই বইটা করা ছাড়াও যে আপনি সকলকে নিয়ে কাজ করার চেষ্টা করেছেন এই সময়টায়, সেটার কথা একটু আমাদের বলবেন?
হ্যাঁ, মানে যেটা হলো সেটা হচ্ছে প্রথম ক্রাইসিসটা আমার নিজের কে কোথাও একটা তৈরি করে তোলাটা ছিল। তো তারপরে যখন সেটা কিছুটা ভরসা জুটলো, তখন যেটা হলো সেটা হচ্ছে এই যে সভ্যতার একটা ভয়ঙ্করতম বিয়োগ পর্বের মধ্যে আমরা পড়েছি, তখন স্বাভাবিকভাবেই সেই অবস্থার মধ্যেও কতখানি সংযোগের আবহাওয়া, বাতাবরণ তৈরি করে তোলা যায়। তো সেইটার ক্ষেত্রে সত্যি সত্যি আমি তার আগে খুব টেকসাভি একেবারেই ছিলাম না, সত্যি কথা বলতে। ইভেন বাংলা টাইপ করতে পারতাম না, কিন্তু ওই পরিস্থিতিতে আমাকে একটু একটু করে সেগুলো শিখতে হলো। এবং তখন যেটা হলো সেটা হচ্ছে সোশ্যাল মিডিয়ার কিছুটা সাহায্য পাওয়া গেল, কিছুটা ওভার দ্য টেলিফোন ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। ফলে দেখা গেল যে কেউ হয়তো বসে আছে, মানে সে পিএইচডি করতে গিয়ে আমেরিকা আটকে পড়েছে, কেউ ব্যাঙ্গালোরে চাকরি সূত্রে গেছে, সেখানে বসে আছে। এবার হয়তো এখানকার একটা কবিতা, সেই কবিতাটার উপরে ওখানকার দুজনে মিলে কোনো একটা নাচ কম্পোজিশন করছে, তার সঙ্গে ব্যাঙ্গালোরে যে আছে সে গানটা করছে, পুরো সাউন্ড মিক্সিংটা হয়তো কলকাতায় বসে আরেকজন করছেন, আমি হয়তো তখন শান্তিনিকেতনে বসে। ফলে সবাই মিলে একটা কাজ করার পর যখন সেটা তারপরে আরো কিছু মানুষজনের জন্য রাখা হচ্ছে, তখন তারা সেটার সাথে কানেক্ট করছে। ফলে এইভাবে হয়তো প্রত্যেকে এক একটা খুপড়িতে আমরা বসে আছি, কিন্তু কোথাও আমাদের অনুভূতিগুলো, কোথাও আমাদের ভাবনা চিন্তাগুলো একটু একটু করে আমরা যোগ করতে পারছি। মানে যেটা আমি দেখেছি যে একটা সময় সত্যি সত্যি অনেক মানুষের মনে হচ্ছিল যে ভাইরাসটা ভগবানের মতো। ফলে সবার মনে হলো পরিবেশ রক্ষা করার জন্য ভগবান এরকম একটা, তো সেটা আমার যেমন খুব একটা পছন্দ হয়নি, সেটা নিয়ে আমি বলছি। অন্য উত্তরে কিছু একটা আসছে, কথাবার্তা হচ্ছে, কিছুদিন পরে ভগবানের জায়গাটা ভ্যাকসিন নিয়ে নিল, তখন মনে হলো ভ্যাকসিন চলে এলে আমরা, মানে এই যে চেঞ্জ হচ্ছে সময়, এবং সেইটায় আমরা হয়তো সবসময় এক জায়গায় মিলিত হতে পারছি না, কিন্তু আমাদের যোগাযোগগুলো করা সম্ভব হচ্ছে। এবং এটা তো সত্যি যে এই যোগাযোগগুলো করা সম্ভব হয়েছে বলেই এই যে করোনাকালের কবিতাটাও বের হতে পারলো, কারণ এই কবিতাগুলো নিয়ে যখন তারপরে আমি কথা বলছি, অদ্বৈত বললো হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ তরিদা এটা খুব, ফলে এবং তারপরে তোমাদের সঙ্গে যখন কথা হলো, হ্যাঁ এটা তো প্রায় একটা দিনলিপির মতো, ফলে আমরা এটাকে, ফলে এই যে সংযোগের জায়গাগুলো, ফলে আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছি যে আসলে এটা সভ্যতার বিয়োগ পর্ব ছিল, কিন্তু সেই বিয়োগ পর্ব আমাকে কোথাও আর 4 জন, আর 10 জন, আর 15 জন, 20 জনের সঙ্গে একটা সংযোগের রাস্তাও তৈরি করে দিতে পারলো। ইনফ্যাক্ট আমি তার আগে সত্যি কথা বলতে কবিতার বই বের করার কথা কোনো ভাবিনি, ছোট থেকে যা লিখেছি। কিন্তু এইটা আমার মনেই হলো যে এই যে এত মানুষের সঙ্গে সংযোগ করা গেল, এই যে ছোটদের গল্পগুলো আমি যখন পাঠাচ্ছি, তখন তো শুধু আমার স্কুলের বাচ্চারা নয়, অন্য অনেক বাচ্চারা, এবং তাদের বাবা মা বলছেন যে আপনি যদি আর দুটো লেখেন তাহলে ও খুব খুশি হচ্ছে, মানে ওর এই সময়টা অন্তত পক্ষে ভালো যাচ্ছে। ফলে এই সবটা নিয়ে, মানে আমি আসলে এই ছোটবেলায় স্কুলে তো ডাকঘর পড়াতে হয়, তো ডাকঘর পড়াতে গিয়ে আমার বারবারই মনে হতো যে অমলের আসল ম্যাজিকটা কি। অমল তো ঘরে বন্দি হয়ে বসে আছে, কিন্তু তার কাছে যে আসে, দইওয়ালা হোক, প্রহরী হোক, যে আসে সেই মুগ্ধ হয়ে ফিরে যায়, কারণ সে বুঝতে পারে সে যে জীবনটা যাপন করছে, মানে দইওয়ালার জীবনটা নিয়ে দইওয়ালা এর আগে কখনো খুশি ছিল না। অমলের কাছে এসে সে হঠাৎ ওই জীবনযাপনটার মধ্যেও যে কতটা মাধুর্য আছে, কতটা ঐশ্বর্য আছে, এইটা বুঝতে পারলো। ফলে তার কাছে তখন মনে হলো যে আমি দই তোমাকে এমনি খাওয়াতে চাই, আমার কোনো পয়সা দরকার নেই। সে প্রথমে কিন্তু রেগেছে। এই যে কোনো জীবনকে তো আমি এপাশ থেকে দেখতে পারি, এপাশ থেকে দেখতে পারি, মানে একটা গ্লাসে অর্ধেক জল আছে, আমি সেটাকে হাফ ফাঁকা বলবো না হাফ জল আছে বলবো। এই দৃষ্টিভঙ্গিটার পার্থক্য আমরা অনেক সময় বড় বড় সমস্যা থেকে মানসিকভাবে হয়তো কিছুটা উত্তরিত হতে পারি। সেই জায়গাটা আমার ভীষণ মনে হয়েছে যখন আমি আস্তে আস্তে অনেকের সাথে যুক্ত হতে পারছি। আমি তো আনন্দ পাচ্ছি, আমার মনে হয়েছে তারাও কোথাও কোথাও এই যে সভ্যতার একটা ভয়ঙ্করতম বিয়োগ পর্ব, সেইটা না, আমরা একে অন্যকে অন্তত ছুঁয়ে থাকতে পারছি, পাশে আছি, এই জায়গাটা কোথাও তৈরি করা গেছে। সেইটা আমার কাছে সত্যি বলছি খুব ভালো লাগার একটা জায়গা।
Shambhobi, I'll come back to you. Thank you for opening up on mental health. It's of course a touchy subject and very difficult to speak about. Do you find translation therapeutic? And has this sort of enabled you in any way to?
Very short answer, yes and no. Because
yes, of course. I mean,
it really depends on what I am translating. As you said, translating Jean Laurent, I can, very firmly say that it was on the whole a traumatic experience. And my trauma was kind of felt not just by me, but people around me as well. My mother would come in and just say, "Tumi ebare eta chhede dao, eta ar korte hobe na." So and even after the book came out, which was obviously people who have published know that what a fulfilling experience that is, taking the book in your hand. But even the book, the design and production of the book, Shorno, who is my publisher, and she is an illustrator herself, and she decorated the book with these wonderful Art Nouveau pictures, and they were very aptly selected. They had mostly fairy tale illustrations by Rackham, and those were in monochrome. So the entire book was in monochrome. It was a dark cover, and even when you had that book in your hand, you felt that and the title in Bengali was Krishno Ithar. So that entire experience, suffice to say, it was not, as a person, I did not find that experience quite pleasant. That said, it was enriching. I mean, an experience doesn't have to be pleasant in order to be enriching. So it was fulfilling in a different kind of way, in an intellectual way, perhaps I should say. It was challenging, and because the language was so dense.
Sometimes when you struggle to render a translation, it may be just the reverse of therapeutic.
Exactly, because and I personally, found I am a very instinctive translator. I don't really, while I'm doing the translator, I don't like to think about it much. After I've done my first draft, that is when I actually start to think about what I'm doing. But with this particular book, I couldn't do that. I had to focus, I had to agonize over every single word that I was using and what the implications of that would be, keeping in mind, ironically, that this was a book that young adult readers would read. This was not, for adults. So you would have to really tone down the, whole mood of the book. So yes, to answer your question, I think translation in the past, I've had experiences which have been really therapeutic because you can, and also I think, once you move away from the personal, because this is not, this is not this is not your own experience. You are engaging with somebody else's experience. That can be really helpful sometimes when you move away from the personal. In this case, unfortunately, it was it was not therapeutic. It was the opposite of therapeutic. But yes, translation can be therapeutic depending on what you are translating.
Thank you. Does anyone in the audience want to ask a question to any of the panelists or everyone maybe?
Thank you for a very interesting and varied discussion. I just wanted to share a very quick experience. I decided to write a book, which initially I had named COVID-19, because I felt all my writing, I always try and provide the reader with a mirror to see themselves and the world around them. And I thought, what better mirror or what more universal mirror than the pandemic? So I was going to write 19 short stories, which I was going to call COVID-19. And the publisher, the marketing people said, well, by the time you write it, COVID will be over. This was in 2020. COVID will be over. And nobody will want to read another story about COVID. So named it Unmasked. And actually, of course, COVID isn't over. It's still not. And we're still masked. But I think what writing these stories revealed to me is how much we social distance, pandemic or no pandemic.
Well, thanks to all of you for listening in. And I would also like to thank everyone for coming here, particularly Anindita, because she had to make more of an effort in a way to join us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation that we had here. Thank you.